So with that, I'm going to turn the screen over to Eric Phillips, our main presenter today, and our moderator, Lauren de Valencia y Sanchez.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Greg, and welcome everybody. And my name, as Greg mentioned, is Lauren de Valencia, and I am the Administrative Director for the board and a lobbyist for APA California. And so as I'm looking at my control panel here, I see we have about 350 participants so far logged in. I understand we have nearly 600 registered for today's webinar. So to say that there is a little bit of interest in this discussion that we're having today on ADUs is certainly an understatement. So we really appreciate everybody taking the time today to join us, and also really want to thank many of you that sent us questions in advance to help us prepare for this webinar. Those really helped us to guide the slides for today. So as you're all aware and why you're here, the legislature passed several bills this year that will likely require cities and counties to amend their existing ordinances regarding the development for ADUs and junior ADUs. And we know why you're really here is because you want to understand exactly what that statute looks like, but also really how to comply with all of the many new requirements for ADU permitting. And so naturally, I think having three similar bills amending the same code sections makes for some difficulty in navigating through what the language looks like. And I can just say from my own experience that lobbying on three similar bills was also certainly a challenge, but we're glad that we've made it to the other side, and we're happy today to have this opportunity to help give some guidance to you all as you're working on implementing these changes. And then also are really happy to have HCD, the Department of Housing and Community Development, here today as well to help through the process. So just to let you all know who we have here today participating on the panel. First is Eric Phillips. He's our Vice President for Policy and Legislation for APA California. He's also a partner with Burke, Williams, and Sorensen. Josh Abrams is joining him. He's principal at Baird and Driskell Community Planning. And then from HCD, we have Paul McDougall, who's the Housing Policy Manager, and Greg Nicholas, who's the Housing Policy Analyst. And so just before we get into everything, just want to remind you, I see our emails are up there. If you have any questions as we are done with this webinar today and you still have questions, please feel free to email them to myself. My email is on the screen. And also to HCD, we will be holding all these questions and sharing them with HCD as they work on their guidance. And then just another quick reminder, if you see a chat window on your screen, please do feel free to type in questions as we're going through the webinar today. I can't promise, knowing how much information we want to give you, that we can get to those questions, but we'll certainly try. And if we don't, we'll make sure to take those down and get back to you. So with that, the chaptered versions of the bills. So the chaptered versions of the ADU bills have all been posted online by now, and below on the screen here is the signing order, at least for the first three important bills that we're mainly covering today, SB 13, AB 68, and AB 881. And that signing order was important because while there were chaptering amendments that were made to all of the bills prior to them being sent to the governor at the end of session, there still were differences within the bills on different provisions, and so that signing order did matter. And actually, even with the chaptering amendments, I think there's still some issues that we will identify and talk about in a little bit. But again, SB 13 was signed first by Senator Wieckowski. AB 68 was second by Assemblymember Ting, and then AB 881 by Assemblymember Bloom was signed last. And so that did knock out some of the provisions in the previous two bills. So with that in mind, the following provisions of each of the bills will become operative as of January 1st, 2020, which I know you all know because you're working feverishly to understand them all. So AB 881, Section 1.5 is the bulk of the changes, and that is the operative section of that bill. However, it's just really important to note that that section does sunset in 2025 and is replaced by Section 2.5 of AB 881 because there's a sunset clause on the restrictions for the ability to require owner occupancy that sunsets in 2025. Secondly, AB 68, the operative language of that bill is found in Section 2, and this is specifically related to those JADUs, those junior ADUs. And then finally, on SB 13, Section 3 is the operative language of that bill, and that's specifically related to delayed enforcement for building standards of existing units. So again, as I said, those chaptered versions of the bills are all posted online. However, you won't see the new code sections updated until, with all the changes that were made in these bills, until hopefully January, I assume, of next year. So just keep that in mind as you're looking online. And then the other three bills that we have listed here today are also other bills that made more moderate changes to ADU law. We'll cover them very, very briefly today because I think the focus is really on the major changes in the three bills up above. So with that, before I turn it over to Eric and Josh to really get into the details of everything, I just did want to take a minute to recap APA's process this year with the bills and just a little insight of why I think we continue to see so many bills related to ADUs introduced yearly. So in 2016, you're all aware that there were two bills that substantially changed ADU law, and those were, of course, both signed into law by then Governor Jerry Brown. And at the time, because there were two bills, we went through a similar process of trying to understand the language, maybe not nearly as much because now we have three bills to do that with, but nevertheless, those really kicked off the major changes in ADU law and really kicked up the permitting from that point on. In 2017, there were two additional cleanup bills to those two bills, which is not surprising. And then last year, we did see three bills that have a lot of the same provisions that you see that passed this year, but three bills that moved their way through the legislature that would have substantially amended ADU law last year. Now, they did not obviously make it to the governor. Two got very close, but that is why they were essentially reintroduced this year. So this year, APA wanted to continue to attempt to work with the authors on identifying our major concerns with the bills and figuring out a way to work together to remove opposition that we had to some of the specific provisions in the bills. And thankfully, we were able to get to that point where we were able to remove opposition and maintain a neutral position on the bills. But just for everybody's information, I think APA California's main concerns were in these three bills were the removal of the ability to require owner occupancy indefinitely, and the restriction on the outright restriction on impact fees. And so I think, as you know, Eric and Josh and everybody will go through, we know that perhaps the amendments and the amendments that reflect the changes to these two issues are not perfect. We were glad that we were able to work with the authors' offices and committee staff to find a solution that allowed APA to take a neutral position. And so just, finally, overall, APA has a support position and policy in our ledge platform on ADUs. We do believe they're an important source of housing, but I think our overall concern on top of the specific changes in these bills is that we do continue to see bills introduced every year that do continue to move the bar as it relates to permitting for ADUs. We know ADU permitting has gone way up since 2016, and we're really glad to see that. And so we do think that the laws that were changed in 2016, they met, the goal was met, and we hope continues to be met. And we did believe and do believe still that there should be time to comply. But nevertheless, I think from the perspective of the legislature, they do feel that and have said that some jurisdictions put up new roadblocks every time bills are passed relating to ADUs to make it harder to permit on a different issue. And so until, in their view, that stops, they will keep introducing legislation on ADUs. So with that said, with the bill signed this year, I think we hope that we don't see any major legislation introduced again next year. I can just say last thing is that we do understand that there will likely be a cleanup bill. And frankly, I think that's probably warranted. I think it would probably be helpful for folks. And as long as it truly, truly is a cleanup bill, we would welcome that. And just as a side note, I wouldn't know what it would be like to have a session without an ADU bill. So I would certainly expect to see something. So with that, I'll turn it over to Eric and Josh.
Hey, thank you, Lauren. Thanks for setting the table there and giving some of the context. and we will be going through some of the new substantive requirements, some of the changes that you likely need to be making to your ADU ordinances, because as Lauren alluded to, there were lots of new changes that restrict cities and counties' ability to regulate ADUs, and I'm willing to bet that almost nobody who called in today has an ADU ordinance that's perfectly aligned with the new laws. So we're going to go through those requirements quickly so that everyone's familiar with them. And then, yeah, we will highlight areas, as Lauren was mentioning, that there's still unanswered questions, and hopefully that will inform the technical assistance we get from HCD and any changes that we see later this year. But the reason that there's such an urgency to update your ordinance is the third bullet that you see here on the slide, that there's a provision right at the beginning of the government code section on ADUs that says that the actual literal language in the statute says that an ADU ordinance that does not meet the requirements set in the government code, that ordinance shall be null and void, and the agency is limited to only applying the statutes or the standards that are set forth in the statute, Section A of the statute. So it's important to have a conforming ordinance. Here on the slide, we've said that conflicting local provisions are null and void. I find it hard to believe that a court would find that an otherwise conforming ordinance was totally turned to dust because it had the parking standard wrong. But that is a reasonable and a possible way to interpret the law. So people should be making an effort to update their ordinances, get them conforming as soon as possible. And certainly, if you don't have an updated ordinance, don't enforce any conflicting provisions. Those are clearly preempted at this point. Once you have adopted a new ADU ordinance or amendments to a current ADU ordinance, within 60 days of that action, you have to send it up to HCD. As Lauren mentioned at the beginning, we're fortunate to have two representatives from HCD on the webinar. They'll be speaking later in the panel to explain what their role will be in reviewing those and related to enforcement. But at the highest level, HCD is authorized to send comments back to you as a city or county, letting you know if they think any of the provisions are in conflict and if they recommend changes being made. The one good news that I have for you is that as you're rushing to adopt these new ordinances, the actions that you take are exempt from CEQA. There's a specific CEQA exemption right in the Public Resources Code that you can use. So at least you don't have to worry about a CEQA process as you're routing your updated ordinances through your Planning Commission and City Council hearing process. And then turning to what the new legislation actually requires for the review and approval process, still continues to provide that all permits for ADUs and junior ADUs have to be reviewed ministerially. There's no discretionary review or hearings that are permitted in connection with issuing permits to build ADUs. As I mentioned, ordinances are not allowed to conflict with the provisions of the government code. It's subsections A through D basically define all of the areas that cities and counties are allowed to regulate. And then subsection E of the statute creates 4 specific types of ADUs that must be approved. And we'll talk about all of those in more detail in just a moment. The other process requirement that has been changed is that now public agencies only have 60 days from a completed application to act on a permit application. The law as it stands today would have allowed for a 120-day review period, and that's been shortened to 60 days. The exception to that is if an ADU is being built in conjunction with a proposed new single-family home, the permit can be processed along with that single-family home permit on the same time frame. However, the ADU approval itself still has to be a ministerial approval for the ADU component of that. There's also language in subsection B that says that if you have not acted on this complete application within 60 days, the application shall be deemed approved, but that subsection B is only applicable when the local agency has not adopted a compliant ADU ordinance. There's still the 60-day time frame in subsection A. That's applicable regardless, but the deemed approved language only is effective in a paragraph that says that is applying to jurisdictions that don't have compliant ordinances. So it's another reason to make sure that you have a fully compliant ordinance, is that it keeps you in the subsection A processing requirements and avoids the additional deemed approved language in subsection B. The question there is then what happens if you don't approve within 60 days, even if you do have a compliant ordinance. But I think someone could then seek an enforcement action to try and enforce a decision, but it doesn't have that same deemed approved language, at least. So standards that apply to ADUs, I think one of the biggest changes is changing the amount of discretion that cities and counties have for the locations of where they have to allow ADUs. Anywhere where residential uses are allowed, ADUs must also be allowed, with just a few limited exceptions. And under the current law that's effective today, jurisdictions had much more discretion as to designate their locations and where they wanted to have ADUs. An example of criteria they could use was for adequacy of sewer and water, fire, public safety, other concerns. But now, the only reason you can disallow an ADU within a zone or a geographic area is based on adequacy of water, impact of the ADU on traffic flow, and public safety. Apart from those three reasons, everywhere that residential uses are allowed, an ADU also has to be allowed to be developed. Lauren mentioned this in the opening remarks too, but owner occupancy requirements are no longer permitted, and that is effective through 2025. And it'll be interesting to see their advocates have been concerned that the owner occupancy requirements made it harder to develop or finance ADUs. Even homeowners could have trouble getting a loan. The flip side is that owner occupancy, I think, is generally correlated with lower rents and potentially more affordability. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out during the next 5-year period, while owner occupancy requirements are not allowed to be required. And we're reading this as probably only applying prospectively. So if you have existing owner occupancy requirements that have been adopted and applied to projects previously, it's not that you necessarily have to give those up, but any new approvals that get issued cannot be made subject to an owner occupancy requirement until 2025. Also related to who gets to use the ADUs, jurisdictions are allowed to prohibit short-term vacation rentals in any ADU, and they are affirmatively required to prohibit vacation rentals in ADUs that are created under subsection E, which are those 4 categories of ADUs that you must approve. And we'll talk about that again in a little bit, but it's one area where you have some flexibility to decide if you want to prohibit short-term rentals elsewhere as well. And then finally, there's a new provision that was added through AB 587 that gives jurisdictions the option of adopting an ordinance to allow for ADUs to be sold under certain circumstances. It's an exception to almost the Subdivision Map Act, really, and it is created almost like the Habitat for Humanity exemption. You have to have a qualifying nonprofit be associated with the development of the housing. It has to be sold to low-income households with a 30-year affordability window, and there's a 45-year restriction that it has to run with the unit that makes the unit be held as a tenancy in common, and if the homeowner wants to sell, they not only have to sell to a low-income household, but if they can't find one, then they have to sell it back to the nonprofit who helped develop it originally. So it does create a new option for affordable home ownership if that's something you want to authorize in your jurisdiction. Looking at more regulations that you're allowed to regulate under subsection A of the applicable provisions of the government code, there's express provisions that say you can regulate parking, height, setback, architectural standards, etc., as long as all of those standards are either included directly or incorporated by reference into your ADU ordinance, and they have to be able to be applied ministerially, because remember, it's a ministerial process. There is a specific prohibition on enforcing minimum lot size requirements, so you can't require a certain lot size as a condition of developing an ADU. However, we're reading it to continue to allow lot coverage requirements. The express permission to have a lot coverage requirement was taken out of subsection A, but it's still discussed in subsection C and other parts of the statute. So if you want to have a lot coverage requirement, you can. However, there's a limitation on that, which I'll talk about in just one second. As a general matter, any conversions of existing structures in the ground already, no setback is required for those beyond what exists with the existing structure. And for any expansion or development of a new ADU, the maximum side and rear yard setback would be 4 feet. You can have maximum and minimum size requirements associated with your ADU. However, your minimum size, you have to allow at least the development of an efficiency unit. The Health and Safety Code provides a definition of efficiency units that can go as low as 150 square feet. The maximum size that you can require has to be at least 850 square feet for an ADU, or if it's a 2-bedroom or larger ADU, 1,000 square feet. However, even if you have those size requirements, you have to allow development of at least an 800 square foot ADU that's 16 feet in height with the 4-foot side and rear yard setback. So putting those all together, I think one way to think about it is that it works a little bit like a density bonus waiver would, is that you can have setback requirements, you can have lot coverage requirements, you can have maximum size requirements. However, if those requirements keep a property owner from being able to develop an 800 square foot ADU, you have to waive those requirements so that they can develop at least that minimum size 800 square foot ADU. Looking at the parking requirements, there's a maximum of 1 space per bedroom or per ADU. So that would mean that an efficiency or studio that doesn't have bedrooms probably has no parking. You have to allow tandem parking with very limited exceptions. And this is another change. If an existing parking area is converted to an ADU, no replacement parking, not just for the ADU, but for the original single-family use or residential use can be required. You used to be able to require replacement parking, but that's no longer the case. So if a garage or parking area is being converted or demolished to create an ADU, no more replacement parking. On top of that, there's parking limitations for the ADU unit itself. If it's within half-a-mile walking distance of transit, and now the definition of transit has been clarified so that it clearly includes bus stops, and it's a walking distance. Now, that was not clear in the previous versions of this, but no parking if you're within a half-mile walk of public transit, including a bus stop. And then there's other categories. For example, it's an internal conversion, you're close to a car share, etc. No parking for the ADU can be required. So I mentioned earlier that there's 4 categories of ADUs that you must approve, and those are defined in subsection E. And the first two apply to approval on single-family lots. And this section says that regardless of all of the other restrictions you have that you're allowed to impose in sections A through D, you have to allow at least these types of ADUs. So a property owner that has either an existing single-family unit or is proposing to build a single-family unit can build one ADU or junior ADU within that single-family unit. And there's some size requirements. And you have to have exterior access, and the setbacks have to be sufficient for fire safety. But apart from that, no other local standards would apply, and no parking would be required. You also, a property owner that has an existing or proposed single-family unit has the ability to build a detached ADU, and we talked about this on 2 slides ago. It has to be up to 800 square feet, 16-foot height limit, and 4-foot side and rear yard setbacks, and they're allowed to combine it with a junior ADU under the first provision. So this basically creates the opportunity for a property owner to have a single-family unit, an interior junior ADU, and a freestanding ADU on any lot where a single-family unit either is developed or could be developed. So up to 3 units that meet these size requirements must be approved. For multifamily lots, this is another new category where ADUs must be approved. So within an existing multifamily building, multiple ADUs have to be applied. The property owner can convert any space within a multifamily building that's not being used as livable space. So the statute gives examples like storage rooms, garages, boiler rooms even, but the limiting factor is that the residence that's being created has to meet residential building code standards. And the size limitation there is that you have to allow 25% of the existing units that are in the building or 1 unit, whichever is greater. So in a triplex, 1 unit is bigger than 25%. You have to allow 1 ADU. In a 4-plex, still 1 ADU. In a multifamily building with 16 units, you'd have to allow 4 ADUs to be developed. In another category would be freestanding ADUs on the same lot where there are existing multifamily units, up to 2 ADUs that are detached from the existing building with a 16-foot height limit and 4-foot side and rear setbacks have to be approved. These subsection E ADUs, the 4 categories I just reviewed, have some additional limitations on them. One, you can't require any correction of non-conforming zoning as a condition of approval. So if you have a legal non-conforming residential use on the site, they still can build any one of these 4 types of ADUs. No fire sprinklers are allowed to be required unless they're also required in the primary residence. As I mentioned before, any one of these 4 categories of ADUs have to be used for 30 days or longer. No short-term rentals can be allowed here. And then there's some requirements around perk test if they're on an on-site water treatment system. And an interesting, I guess it's a perk for any jurisdiction that had an ordinance that allowed ADUs within multifamily buildings prior to July 1st, 2018, can continue to enforce its design development and historic standards, even though that would otherwise potentially be precluded by this subsection E. During the intro remarks, Lauren talked about the fee reductions that are associated with these new bills. So now an ADU that's smaller than 750 square feet is exempt from any impact fees, basically a fee that you could charge under the Mitigation Fee Act. So a traffic fee, public services, open space, it's exempt from any one of those fees. For an ADU that's bigger than 750 square feet, the fee has to be charged proportionally in relation to the primary unit. So that's easy to do, I think, if you have impact fees that are charged on a per square foot basis. But if you tend to charge them on a unit basis, it requires a little bit of math. So like, for example, if you're developing a 1,600 square foot single family home and an 800 square foot ADU, the ADU would only be charged 50% of the impact fees because its square footage is 50% of the primary dwelling unit. There's also a limitation on connection fees and capacity charges for utilities. ADUs and junior ADUs that are developed within a existing or proposed single family home, there's no connection fee or capacity charge and no direct utility connection. For all other ADUs, the capacity charges and connection fees have to be proportionate to the use that's being provided by that ADU. There's an interesting provision here that I'll flag that comes out of Section A3 that says that the local agency can charge fees to reimburse for implementation costs, which include costs to adopt or amend the ADU ordinance. So I guess track the fees that you're expending to create your new compliant ADU ordinances, and there's a cost recovery opportunity there for you. Then finally, before I turn it over to Josh, the ADU changes that got caught up in some of the other bills affect the enforcement of code violations in ADUs. For any ADUs built before January 1, 2020, or in a jurisdiction that has a non-compliant ADU ordinance even after January 2020, the owner can request delayed code enforcement of building standards for a 5-year period. So they have a grace period to bring their building up to code. However, that waiver and that delay won't be granted if the violation is necessary to protect health and safety. And that provision will sunset in 2030. Junior ADU standards have been relaxed a little bit more even, though the changes there I think are less minor. There's a restriction on private CC&Rs in common interest developments and basically in condos or places with HOAs, so that a CC&R provision that would prohibit or put unreasonable restrictions on ADUs or JADUs won't be enforceable. And then finally, under AB 671, the next housing element has to include a plan that will incentivize and promote the development of ADUs that could be offered at an affordable rent. And HCD representatives that are on the line might say more about this during their section, but they'll be providing guidelines about implementation. And current practice is that you can count ADUs towards your RHNA. You can count them in your housing element if you have evidence based on past production and affordability. And then as ADUs are being developed in your jurisdiction, you can count them on your APR based on their actual affordability. So ADUs can be a helpful tool in meeting the regional housing needs that way. So just when you thought, oh good, the lawyer's gonna stop talking, it's even worse. It's a pop quiz, and I'm going to turn it over to Josh to facilitate that section.
Great. Hi, everybody. I'm Josh Abrams. I staff a group called 21 Elements. We help San Mateo County jurisdictions with housing policy. So we don't advocate, but if cities are interested in doing good housing policy, we help them implement it. And we're, of course, because everyone has to update the ADU ordinances, were really involved in helping them understand and producing materials to make that smoother. We're going to do a pop quiz just to help everyone reinforce some of the lessons that Eric talked about. I regret to tell you that if you get any of the answers wrong, your CM credits will be null and void. It's to be determined if your entire CM history will be null and void or just the provisions working related to ADUs. Okay, so we're going to move forward, and hopefully a quiz will appear on everyone's screen in just a second. So the first question is, starting January 1st, how many days do cities have to act on a complete application? And you can vote.
All right, I'm going to close in 3, 2, 1.
All right, good. So we had most people have the correct answer, which is you have 60 days. It was 120, so it was shortened. The good news for 4% of the people who said 30 days, you have twice as long as you thought. Okay, the next question, question 2. A building owner has a 200-unit apartment with 300 parking spaces in a garage near a bus stop. She proposes the following. Removing 100 parking spaces, so that would be 200 remain, and converting them to 50 ADUs. She would not make up the parking anywhere, and her proposal meets building standards. Is the city obligated to permit those 50 units? Just take a second and think about that. I know it was a lot.
And we're going to go 3, 2, 1. Last chance to get your answers in. And closed.
Yeah, so most people got that right. That's great. Yes, so the city would be obligated to permit those units. There's a couple of caveats that are really important there. The first is that it's in existing space. So if she had, alternatively, if the building owner had proposed building them in the backyard or converting filling a pool and putting ADUs where the yard or the pool used to be, that wouldn't have been permitted. It has to be in existing space. She does have to follow the building code. She's allowed to do 1/4 of the unit. So it was a 200-unit apartment. 1/4 is 50, so she maxed out. It's not 50 plus 2. If you remember earlier, there was 2 questions. Either you could build 1/4 of the units or 2 units, whichever is greater, but you don't get to build both of those. So 50 is 1/4 of the units.
And then I'll just add, just to muddy the waters there a little bit, the mandatory ADU approval, it says that a property owner can pick from any of the 4 categories that are listed. So I think Josh is probably right that the intent was that you pick either your 25% or your 2 external, but the language is such that it says pick any. It could be interpreted that they could build 25% interior to the building plus 2 exterior to the building in a multifamily situation.
There'll be a lot of questions like that where we'll try and flag what we think our interpretation is and then flag if there's an alternate interpretation. It would get a little also muddier if it weren't near if she wasn't taking advantage of that the 1/4 mile from transit, because then she would potentially, again, this is something where there's some debate, she might have to make up those parking units. And it's the same, also applying other zoning standards like what the facade looked like if there were objective design standards when they were converting that garage to ADUs. It's another one where it's a little murky whether or not what the city would be able to apply. Okay, the question 3 is, when can cities use discretionary review for approving ADUs? And there are 3 options.
And I'm going to close in 3, 2, 1.
So most people said it was never I think the one interpretation, I think the main interpretation is if a property owner meets all of the standards of the state law or the ordinance, then you have to approve it without discretionary review. But if for some reason they don't meet those standards, they could still apply for a CUP or other hearing that would then allow cities to use discretionary review. So generally, yes, you all are right that the answer would be you need to have a ministerial process to approve, but there might be some exceptions where there's a homeowner is asking for something, a larger unit or something outside the bounds of what's typically allowed.
Yeah, I think that larger unit's a good example where you have maximums that you have to accommodate, but nothing is prohibiting you from also allowing larger ADUs to develop, and potentially those could be subject to a different process.
Great. Question 4 is, can cities allow neighbors to appeal an ADU approval if the ADU meets all the objective criteria. The third choice is supposed to say it's a waste of time and everyone would get annoyed or something like that.
Okay, so yeah, we've got good response here. I'm going to go ahead and close in 3, 2, 1.
So I think my reading is you actually can have an appeals process, but it probably doesn't make sense. You might, in some cases, you might actually want to have an appeals process in your ordinance if someone believes staff misinterpreted the size of the ADU or somehow messed up procedurally. You might want to give people an option to appeal without going to court. But it has to be really clear that if they appeal, whatever board it goes to or whatever officer it goes to can't apply discretionary standards. They can only apply ministerial standards. And there's a broader point that goes with this one, that if you have that appeal, it just came up in a city in San Mateo County where things were appealed. The planning commission or council took the right action and said it was granted correctly, the homeowner's allowed to build it, but everyone was frustrated that they went through the appeals process. So not only is it important to update your ordinance, but it's really good to educate all of the staff to make sure they're applying it consistently, and then look at the procedures as well to make sure they make sense with the new rules. Okay. Question 5 is, generally, cities must allow ADUs in all zones that allow single or multifamily housing, but cities have a small amount of discretion. What can cities use to regulate where ADUs are regulated? Check all that apply.
And we're going to close in 3, 2, 1.
Great. It looks like most people got the right answer for that. So you can definitely use water, sewer, you can use traffic flow, and you can use public safety. But as we talked about earlier, you're no longer allowed to use lot size. That's the big one. And agricultural uses, you can build agricultural housing in agricultural land, and therefore you can build housing. And therefore, if you can build housing, you most likely are going to be able to build an ADU. Okay. Question 6 is, if a city wants to set a maximum size for an ADU, what's the smallest size they can set it at?
And we're going to close in 3, 2, 1.
So the answer is 850 feet or 1,000 feet if it's a studio or a one-bedroom. The legislation is definitely confusing because there's all these different numbers for different parts that apply in different rules. So there's this special category where everyone's allowed to build with special rules more easily. That's that 800 square foot rule. But the cities have to allow up to 850 or 1,000. And the 1,200 is perhaps, it's hard to interpret exactly what that is. That's kind of the default maximum size of an ADU, but cities can go above that. Perhaps if you don't adopt a ordinance, that 1,200 square foot might come into play.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That the 1,200 is the default, but there's a provision that if you want to be more permissive, you could be bigger. That 800 square foot is tricky, but that's the waiver provision. But you are allowed to have a larger maximum than that, as long as you're prepared to waive it for ADUs that meet those criteria.
So the next question is, a homeowner wants to build a 14-foot high, 500 square foot ADU in their backyard with 5-foot setbacks all around. It violates a couple of rules: city's lot coverage, FAR, and architectural standards. Does the city need to approve the building permit?
Well, this one's neck and neck, but I'm going to close in 3, 2, 1.
And it might actually be good it's neck and neck because I think there's a little bit of room for argument about this. So this is that special rule where we can call it the Section E ADUs or the special category of ADUs where homeowners have more rights. So they meet the rules for that. It's less than 16 feet tall. It's less than 800 square feet. It's in their backyard. Only the backyard setbacks are changed. And the one question that makes it a little fuzzy is, can the city apply its architectural standards? Some people argue that cities can't apply any other standards from besides those like 4-foot setback, 800 square foot maximum.
Including some people sitting next to Josh.
Yeah, right. Eric, I think there's a very reasonable argument that cities can apply other standards, that the intent of that legislation is anyone who wants to build a unit up to 800 square feet, you have to let them, as long as they can fit it in with 4-foot setbacks, but that it wasn't trying to preclude everyone else, all the other rules. But that's something where I think that it's just not clear at this point. So however your city or your city attorney wants to interpret it, you can.
Yeah, and as the more conservative voice on that, I do think that because it's in that subsection E, which sets it apart from all of the authority that you have to regulate under A and D, that your authority to regulate there is limited. But I know that Josh gave a very good explanation for the counter argument to that. So there's room for reasonable people to disagree. So the advice to consult your local city attorney is a good one.
Okay, so we're just going to move on. Thanks for doing that. Hopefully that reinforced some of the topics. Thought it would be helpful to talk a little about where cities still have some discretion to regulate, and I'll just thank Goldfarb and Littman because they have a nice list that I borrowed from for the topics where cities can set their own standards. Of course, we know, we just talked about, you can limit it based on traffic, water, sewer, public safety. You have the option to ban all short-term rentals. You have to not allow some, but you could ban all short-term vacation rentals. You can allow cities to form tenancy in commons allow nonprofits to form TICs. There are some standards you can apply, objective design standards or landscaping standards, usable open space standards. Lot coverage is another one where there's a little bit of debate, but potentially you can apply lot coverage standards except for the category E ones, daylight and shadow. You could allow larger than 850,000, and you can still apply historic preservation standards. These are pretty broad. There's I think Eric covered it in a little more detail. I'm just trying to summarize it here too. Again, in a different format. For the parking, you can, of course, right now the limit would be 0 to 1 spots, but you could make it 0 for all. And you could also limit off-street parking as part of a neighborhood parking permit system if you don't require any spots for that ADU. You could require owner occupancy post 2025, and generally in any spot, any examples, you can be more permissive than state laws. So those are the things generally for your ordinance where you have some freedom on. It's not that many. It's fairly straightforward. And then we wanted to, before we switch to HCD, we wanted to talk a little about, help everyone think about what the next steps are. The first step, I think, is most important, just to talk with your planning commission, your council, and the public so they know what to expect. This could be a study session or whatever format works for you, but it's fairly complicated. There's a lot of changes, and it's good just to help everyone understand where cities have freedom and where they don't. Update the ordinance, of course, and as I was talking about a little earlier, it's really important just to update the procedures as well. Look what processes you have and make sure that they work and they make sense with the new laws so people aren't appealing things where the result is the appeal has to be dismissed. Educating staff as well so everyone's consistently interpreting it. And then there's this important decision, what are you going to do post January 1st? Because most cities won't have their ordinances fully updated by January 1st. One option would be to go to the complete null and void standard where everyone gets 1,200 square feet and basically it's I think of it as a little more like the Wild West. You can do anything you want. The other one would be just to revert to or defer if there's a conflicting standard. Now that's the more common interpretation. I think that's what most cities are doing. The letter of the law, there's an argument for the completely null and void ordinance. So I think it's important to figure out who has to decide what procedures you're going to do post January 1st and start preparing to do them until you get the ordinance fully updated. Okay, and with that, we're going to switch it to HCD.
Ready? Hello, this is Greg Nicholas with HCD, sitting here with Paul McDougall. Hello, everybody. Can you hear us okay?
We can hear you, but they're all muted. Yeah. So silence means assent, but go ahead, Greg. We've got just a few minutes. So
HCD's efforts pertaining to accessory dwelling units and junior accessory dwelling units are generally bundled into these three areas: technical assistance, funding, and accountability. Under the technical assistance, HCD will include a TA notice addressing recent ADU legislation, and we're going to be providing that to planning directors and other interested persons that are on our ADU update list. This AD memo will also be included and posted at our website. It will include a summary of changes that are affected by the recent legislation. And although note, like we've done in the past, the legislation will be added to our memo, and we will strike changes or deletions from current law and add text with underlines to show where text has been added to the current legislation. We expect that to be available soon. Again, it'll be going to all planning directors and it'll be posted on our website. We'll also be updating our TA ADU memorandum booklet, about 36 pages now, and we'll be adding a lot of FAQs to it. We'll be adding the statutes that are going into effect January 1. As we have now, it'll also include model ordinances that reflect the changes in law. And we will also be continuing to offer reviews of draft accessory dwelling unit ordinances to submit it to us as requested by the cities and counties. HCD also offers best practices, which are currently available on an SB2 map that it's accessible at the HCD site, and we have working with coordination with UC Berkeley on additional ADU items. Okay. Under the funding category, we have SB2, the LEAP, LEAP, and REAP, or EAP planning grant programs. They're offered which allow AD ordinances eligibility for funding. In addition, AB 101 amends the Health and Safety Code to authorize HCD to make grants to local agencies or nonprofit associations to construct ADUs and JADUs. The funds are available through the Cal Home program. Other examples of funding assistance include Cal HFA, such as for the Clovis pilot project, and HCD will continue to evaluate opportunities on other programs such as Home and LHFTF. Finally,
Craig, can you just remind everyone what LEAP and REAP is? Because I think some people might not know that there's funding coming their way for that.
Yeah, I'm glad to do that. So, as part of the governor's budget and housing package, $250 million was authorized to go into two different programs for the purposes of accelerating housing production and facilitating compliance with your 6-cycle and housing element. And the two big buckets are the local, work on those planning funds, those planning grants, early action planning grants, and the LEAP stands for local governments, where local governments will be eligible, and the REAP is basically going straight to regional governments, where they will utilize the resources for a variety of activities, including improving the RENA methodology, best practices, technical assistance consulting, and what is being called a sub-allocation process, which could potentially include local governments. And so that calls out all the eligible uses, a lot of things related to accelerating housing production, and ADUs is definitely a solid fit there. And I just want to point real quick back to the first slide on the financial, the AB 101, as also that's the governor's budget calls out ADUs and a couple of programs. I should say financial resources. I'm not sure if they're grants, but they might be. I forget, but that should be a little bit broad. So don't put us on the hook on that. Maybe we'll change that later. Let's go ahead and shoot ahead 2 slides.
Okay, accountability. Finally, accountability. A lot of changes here. We are been allowed to review and comment on ADU ordinances that are submitted to us. But enforcement beyond that is really not been allowed, but the big changes in January 1 coming up. So we may review ordinances and submit written findings to local jurisdictions, and they have a time period to respond back to HCD with potential changes to their ordinances to bring them into compliance with state law. Much beyond that, though, a status of HCD enforcement program, we're working on that. Future consideration is sort of the same thing. We're exploring options here to see what the best way to do it is, and we'll probably still continue relying on complaints received by us from applicants about non-compliance with state law.
Awesome, thank you. Hopefully that's a tough note to end on for fall.
Maybe we should that one up.
Yeah, we should have done them, and the funding should have been last, so we could end more cheerfully. But Lauren, do you want to wrap it up here?
We are here to assist.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, and on that note, thank you everyone for sticking around, and we're taking you into the 4 o'clock hour here, and you all held on, so really appreciate that. And again, my email is up on the screen, as is HCD's email, but please do feel free to send us questions that you have post this webinar. And then also, I would just welcome any emails related to if you're finding things that are inconsistent or that are ambiguous in the bill or in the statutes currently, please let us know, or please let me know, and I'd be happy to hold on to that. And if there is cleanup legislation next year, we can share that with the author or the committee that carries the bill, whatever the case may be. But just let me know really if there's any issues. And thank you again for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Again, we will be posting the slides here today on the APA California website, and it will make its way on the APA California YouTube page soon. So with that, unless there's anything else from the panel, I wish you all a great evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.